Warning: this video contains mature content. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello Internet, Mike Bertolini here. The following three stories are LibriVox recordings, which are in the public domain. If you'd like more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. To support the channel, please like and subscribe. Now, onto the stories.
The Eyes of the Panther by Ambrose Bierce. 1. One does not always marry when insane. A man and a woman, nature had done the grouping, sat on a rustic seat in the late afternoon. The man was middle-aged, slender, swarthy, with the expression of a poet and the complexion of a pirate, a man at whom one would look again. The woman was young, blonde, graceful, with something in her figure and movements suggesting the word lithe. She was habited in a gray gown with odd brown markings in the texture. She may have been beautiful, one could not readily say, for her eyes denied attention to all else. They were gray-green, long and narrow, with an expression defying analysis. One could only know that they were disquieting. Cleopatra may have had such eyes. The man and the woman talked. "Yes," said the woman, "I love you, God knows. But marry you, no, I cannot, will not." "Irene, you have said that many times, yet always have denied me a reason. I've a right to know, to understand, to feel, and prove my fortitude if I have it. Give me a reason." "For loving you?" The woman was smiling through her tears and her pallor. That did not stir any sense of humor in the man. "No, there is no reason for that. A reason for not marrying me. I've a right to know. I must know. I will know." He had risen and was standing before her with clenched hands, on his face a frown. It might have been called a scowl. He looked as if he might attempt to learn by strangling her. She smiled no more, merely sat looking up into his face with a fixed, set regard that was utterly without emotion or sentiment. Yet it had something in it that tamed his resentment and made him shiver. "You are determined to have my reason?" she asked in a tone that was entirely mechanical, a tone that might have been her look made audible. "If you please, if I'm not asking too much." Apparently this lord of creation was yielding part of his dominion over his co-creature. "Very well, you shall know. I am insane." The man started, then looked incredulous and was conscious that he ought to be amused. But again the sense of humor failed him in his need, and despite his disbelief, he was profoundly disturbed by that which he did not believe. Between our convictions and our feelings there is no good understanding. "That is what the physicians would say," the woman continued, "if they knew. I might myself prefer to call it a case of possession. Sit down and hear what I have to say." The man silently resumed his seat beside her on the rustic bench by the wayside. Over against them on the eastern side of the valley the hills were already sunset flushed, and the stillness all about was of that peculiar quality that foretells the twilight. Something of its mysterious and significant solemnity had imparted itself to the man's mood. In the spiritual, as in the material world, are signs and presages of night. Rarely meeting her look, and whenever he did so conscious of the indefinable dread with which, despite their feline beauty, her eyes always affected him, Jenner Brading listened in silence to the story told by Irene Marlowe. In deference to the reader's possible prejudice against the artless method of an unpracticed historian, the author ventures to substitute his own version for hers. 2. A room may be too narrow for three, though one is outside. In a little log house containing a single room, sparely and rudely furnished, crouching on the floor against one of the walls, was a woman, clasping to her breast a child. Outside, a dense, unbroken forest extended for many miles in every direction. This was at night, and the room was black dark. No human eye could have discerned the woman and the child. Yet they were observed, narrowly, vigilantly, with never even a momentary slackening of attention. and that is the pivotal fact upon which this narrative turns. Charles Marlowe was of the class, now extinct in this country, of woodmen pioneers, men who found their most acceptable surroundings in sylvan solitudes that stretched along the eastern slope of the Mississippi Valley, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. For more than 100 years these men pushed ever westward, generation after generation, with rifle and axe, reclaiming from nature and her savage children here and there an isolated acreage for the plow, no sooner reclaimed than surrendered to their less venturesome but more thrifty successors. At last they burst through the edge of the forest into the open country, and vanished as if they had fallen over a cliff. The woodman pioneers no more. The pioneer of the plains, he whose easy task it was to subdue for occupancy 2/3 of the country in a single generation, is another and inferior creation. With Charles Marlowe in the wilderness, sharing the dangers, hardships, and privations of that strange, unprofitable life, were his wife and child, to whom, in the manner of his class, in which the domestic virtues were a religion, he was passionately attached. The woman was still young enough to be comely, new enough to the awful isolation of her lot to be cheerful. By withholding the large capacity for happiness which the simple satisfactions of the forest life could not have filled, Heaven had dealt honorably with her. In her light household tasks, her child, her husband, and her few foolish books, she found abundant provision for her needs. One morning in midsummer, Marlowe took down his rifle from the wooden hooks on the wall and signified his intention of getting game. "We've meat," said the wife. "Please don't go out today. I dreamed last night. Oh, such a dreadful thing. I cannot recollect it, but I'm almost sure that it will come to pass if you go out." It is painful to confess that Marlowe received this solemn statement with less of gravity than was due to the mysterious nature of the calamity foreshadowed. In truth, he laughed. "Try to remember," he said. "Maybe you dreamed that baby had lost the power of speech." The conjecture was obviously suggested by the fact that baby, clinging to the fringe of his hunting coat with all her 10 pudgy thumbs, was at that moment uttering her sense of the situation in a series of exultant goo-goos inspired by sight of her father's raccoon skin cap. The woman yielded. Lacking the gift of humor, she could not hold out against his kindly badinage. So, with a kiss for the mother and a kiss for the child, he left the house and closed the door upon his happiness forever. At nightfall he had not returned. The woman prepared supper and waited. Then she put baby to bed and sang softly to her until she slept. By this time the fire on the hearth, at which she had cooked supper, had burned out, and the room was lighted by a single candle. This she afterward placed in the open window as a sign and welcome to the hunter if he should approach from that side. She had thoughtfully closed and barred the door against such wild animals as might prefer it to an open window. By the habits of beasts of prey in entering a house uninvited, she was not advised, though with true female prevision she may have considered the possibility of their entrance by way of the chimney. As the night wore on, she became not less anxious, but more drowsy, and at last rested her arms upon the bed by the child and her head upon the arms. The candle in the window burned down to the socket, sputtered and flared a moment, and went out unobserved, for the woman slept and dreamed. In her dreams, she sat beside the cradle of a second child. The first one was dead. The father was dead. The home in the forest was lost, and the dwelling in which she lived was unfamiliar. There were heavy oaken doors, always closed, and outside the windows, fastened into the thick stone walls, were iron bars, obviously, so she thought, a provision against Indians. All this she noted with an infinite self-pity, but without surprise, an emotion unknown in dreams. The child in the cradle was invisible under its coverlet, which something impelled her to remove. She did so, disclosing the face of a wild animal. In the shock of this dreadful revelation, the dreamer awoke, trembling in the darkness of her cabin in the wood. As a sense of her actual surroundings came slowly back to her, Felt for the child that was not a dream, and assured herself by its breathing that all was well with it, nor could she forbear to pass a hand lightly across its face. Then, moved by some impulse for which she probably could not have accounted, she rose and took the sleeping babe in her arms, holding it close against her breast. The head of the child's cot was against the wall, to which the woman now turned her back as she stood. Lifting her eyes, she saw two bright objects, starring the darkness with a reddish-green glow. She took them to be two coals on the hearth, but with a returning sense of direction came the disquieting consciousness that they were not in that quarter of the room. Moreover, they were too high, being nearly at the level of the eyes, of her own eyes, for these were the eyes of a panther. The beast was at the open window directly opposite and not 5 paces away. Nothing but those terrible eyes was visible, but in the dreadful tumult of her feelings as the situation disclosed itself to her understanding, she somehow knew that the animal was standing on its hinder feet, supporting itself with its paws on the window ledge. That signified a malign interest, not the mere gratification of an indolent curiosity. The consciousness of the attitude was an added horror, accentuating the menace of those awful eyes, in whose steadfast fire her strength and courage were alike consumed. Under their silent questioning she shuddered and turned sick. Her knees failed her, and by degrees, instinctively striving to avoid a sudden movement that might bring the beast upon her, she sank to the floor, crouched against the wall, and tried to shield the babe with her trembling body without withdrawing her gaze from the luminous orbs that were killing her. No thought of her husband came to her in her agony, no hope nor suggestion of rescue or escape. Her capacity for thought and feeling had narrowed to the dimensions of a single emotion: fear of the animal's spring, of the impact of its body, the buffeting of its great arms, the feel of its teeth in her throat, the mangling of her babe. Motionless now and in absolute silence, she awaited her doom, the moments growing to hours, to years, to ages, and still those devilish eyes maintained their watch. Returning to his cabin late at night with a deer on his shoulders, Charles Marlowe tried the door. It did not yield. He knocked. There was no answer. He laid down his deer and went around to the window. As he turned the angle of the building, he fancied he heard a sound as of stealthy footfalls and a rustling in the undergrowth of the forest, but they were too slight for certainty even to his practiced ear. Approaching the window, and to his surprise finding it open, he threw his leg over the sill and entered. All was darkness and silence. He groped his way to the fireplace, struck a match, and lit a candle. Then he looked about. Cowering on the floor against the wall was his wife, clasping his child. As he sprang toward her, she rose and broke into laughter, long, loud, and mechanical, devoid of gladness and devoid of sense, the laughter that is not out of keeping with the clanking of a chain. Hardly knowing what he did, he extended his arms. She laid the babe in them. It was dead, pressed to death in its mother's embrace. 3. The theory of the defense. That is what occurred during a night in a forest, but not all of it did Irene Marlowe relate to Jenner Brading. Not all of it was known to her. When she had concluded, the sun was below the horizon, and the long summer twilight had begun to deepen in the hollows of the land. For some moments Brading was silent, expecting the narrative to be carried forward to some definite connection with the conversation introducing it. But the narrator was as silent as he, her face averted, her hands clasping and unclasping themselves as they lay in her lap, with a singular suggestion of an activity independent of her will. "It is a sad, a terrible story," said Brading at last, "but I do not understand. You call Charles Marlowe father. That I know. That he is old before his time, broken by some great sorrow, I have seen, or thought I saw. But, pardon me, you said that I am insane," said the girl, without a movement of head or body. "But, Irene, you say— Please, dear, do not look away from me. You say that the child was dead, not demented." "Yes, that one. I am the second. I was born 3 months after that night, my mother being mercifully permitted to lay down her life in giving me mine. Brading was again silent. He was a trifle dazed, and could not at once think of the right thing to say. Her face was still turned away. In his embarrassment, he reached impulsively toward the hands that lay closing and unclosing in her lap, but something, he could not have said what, restrained him. He then remembered, vaguely, that he had never altogether cared to take her hand. "Is it likely," she resumed, "that a person born under such circumstances is like others, is what you call sane?" Brading did not reply. He was preoccupied with a new thought that was taking shape in his mind. What a scientist would have called an hypothesis, a detective a theory. It might throw an added light, albeit a lurid one, upon such doubt of her sanity as her own assertion had not dispelled. The country was still new, and outside the villages sparsely populated. The professional hunter was still a familiar figure, and among his trophies were heads and pelts of the larger kinds of game. Tales variously credible of nocturnal meetings with savage animals in lonely roads were sometimes current, passed through the customary stages of growth and decay, and were forgotten. A recent addition to these popular apocrypha, originating apparently by spontaneous generation in several households, was of a panther which had frightened some of their members by looking in at windows by night. The yarn had caused its little ripple of excitement, had even attained to the distinction of a place in the local newspaper, but Brading had given it no attention. Its likeness to the story to which he had just listened now impressed him as perhaps more than accidental. Was it not possible that the one story had suggested the other, that finding congenial conditions in a morbid mind and a fertile fancy, it had grown to the tragic tale that he had heard? Brading recalled certain circumstances of the girl's history and disposition of which, with love's incuriosity, he had hitherto been heedless, such as her solitary life with her father, at whose house no one apparently was an acceptable visitor, and her strange fear of the night by which those who knew her best accounted for her never being seen after dark. Surely in such a mind imagination once kindled might burn with a lawless flame, penetrating and enveloping the entire structure. That she was mad, though the conviction gave him the acutest pain, he could no longer doubt. She had only mistaken an effect of her mental disorder for its cause, bringing into imaginary relation with her own personality the vagaries of the local myth-makers. With some vague intention of testing his new theory, and no very definite notion of how to set about it, he said gravely, but with hesitation, "Irene, dear, tell me. I beg you will not take offense, but tell me." "I have told you," she interrupted, speaking with a passionate earnestness that he had not known her to show. "I have already told you that we cannot marry. Is anything else worth saying?" Before he could stop her, she had sprung from her seat, and without another word or look was gliding away among the trees toward her father's house. Brading had risen to detain her. He stood watching her in silence until she had vanished in the gloom. Suddenly he started as if he had been shot. His face took on an expression of amazement and alarm. In one of the black shadows into which she had disappeared, he had caught a quick, brief glimpse of shining eyes. For an instant he was dazed and irresolute. Then he dashed into the wood after her, shouting, "Irene! Irene! Look out! The panther! The panther!" In a moment he had passed through the fringe of forest into open ground, and saw the girl's gray skirt vanishing into her father's door. The panther was visible. 4. An appeal to the conscience of God. Jenner Brading, attorney at law, lived in a cottage at the edge of the town. Directly behind the dwelling was the forest. Being a bachelor, and therefore by the draconian moral code of the time and place, denied the services of the only species of domestic servant known thereabout, the hired girl, he boarded at the village hotel, where also was his office. The woodside cottage was merely a lodging maintained, at no great cost to be sure, as an evidence of prosperity and respectability. It would hardly do for one to whom the local newspaper had pointed with pride as the foremost jurist of his time to be homeless, albeit he may sometimes have suspected that the words home and house were not strictly synonymous. Indeed, his consciousness of the disparity and his will to harmonize it were matters of logical inference, for it was generally reported that soon after the cottage was built, its owner had made a futile venture in the direction of marriage, had in truth gone so far as to be rejected by the beautiful but eccentric daughter of old man Marlowe, the recluse. This was publicly believed because he had told it himself and she had not, a reversal of the usual order of things which could hardly fail to carry conviction. Brading's bedroom was at the rear of the house, with a single window facing the forest. One night he was awakened by a noise at that window. He could hardly have said what it was like. With a little thrill of the nerves, he sat up in bed and laid hold of the revolver, which, with a forethought most commendable in one addicted to the habit of sleeping on the ground floor with an open window, he had put under his pillow. The room was in absolute darkness, but being unterrified, he knew where to direct his eyes, and there he held them, awaiting in silence what further might occur. He could now dimly discern the aperture, a square of lighter black. Presently there appeared at its lower edge 2 gleaming eyes that burned with a malignant luster inexpressibly terrible. Brading's heart gave a great jump, then seemed to stand still. A chill passed along his spine and through his hair. He felt the blood forsake his cheeks. He could not have cried out, not to save his life, but being a man of courage, he would not, to save his life, have done so if he had been able. Some trepidation his coward body might feel, but his spirit was of sterner stuff. Slowly the shining eyes rose with a steady motion that seemed an approach, and slowly rose Brading's right hand, holding the pistol. He fired. Blinded by the flash and stunned by the report, Brading nevertheless heard, or fancied that he heard, the wild, high scream of the panther, so thin in sound, so devilish in suggestion. Leaping from the bed, he hastily clothed himself, and, pistol in hand, sprang from the door, meeting 2 or 3 men who came running up from the road. A brief explanation was followed by a cautious search of the house. The grass was wet with dew. Beneath the window it had been trodden and partly leveled for a wide space, from which a devious trail, visible in the light of a lantern, led away into the bushes. One of the men stumbled and fell upon his hands, which, as he rose and rubbed them together, were slippery. On examination, they were seen to be red with blood. An encounter, unarmed, with a wounded panther was not agreeable to their taste. All but Brading turned back. He, with lantern and pistol, pushed courageously forward into the wood. Passing through a difficult undergrowth, he came into a small opening, and there his courage had its reward, for there he found the body of his victim. But it was no panther. What it was is told, even to this day, upon a weather-worn headstone in the village churchyard, and for many years was attested daily at the graveside by the bent figure and sorrow-seamed face of old man Marlowe, to whose soul, and to the soul of his strange, unhappy child, peace, peace and reparation.
A Phantom Toe. I am not a superstitious man, far from it, but despite all my efforts to the contrary, I could not help thinking, directly I had taken a survey of my chamber, that I should never quit it without going through a strange adventure. There was something in its immense size, heaviness, and gloom that seemed to annihilate at one blow all my resolute skepticism as regards supernatural visitations. It appeared to me totally impossible to go into that room and disbelieve in ghosts. The fact is, I had incautiously partaken at supper of that favorite Dutch dish, sauerkraut, and I suppose it had disagreed with me and put strange fancies into my head. Be this as it may, I only know that after parting with my friend for the night, I gradually worked myself up into such a state of fidgetiness that at last I wasn't sure whether I hadn't become a ghost myself. Supposing, ruminated I, Supposing the landlord himself should be a practical robber and should have taken the lock and bolt from off this door for the purpose of entering here in the dead of the night, abstracting all my property, and perhaps murdering me. I thought the dog had a very cutthroat air about him. Now, I had never had any such idea until that moment, for my host was a fat, all Dutchmen are fat, stupid-looking fellow who I don't believe had sense enough to understand what a robbery or murder meant. But somehow or other, whenever we have anything really to annoy us, and it certainly was not pleasant to go to bed in a strange place without being able to fasten one's door, we are sure to aggravate it by myriads of chimeras of our own brain. So on the present occasion, in the midst of 1,000 disagreeable reveries, some of the most wild absurdity, I jumped very gloomily into bed, having first put out my candle. For total darkness was far preferable to its flickering, ghostly light, which transformed rather than revealed objects, and soon fell asleep, perfectly tired out with my day's riding. How long I lay asleep I don't know, but I suddenly awoke from a disagreeable dream of cutthroats, ghosts, and long winding passages in a haunted inn. An indescribable feeling, such as I never before experienced, hung upon me. It seemed as if every nerve in my body had 100 spirits tickling it, and this was accompanied by so great a heat that, inwardly cursing mine host's sauerkraut and wondering how the Dutchmen could endure such poison, I was forced to sit up in bed to cool myself. The whole of the room was profoundly dark, excepting at one place where the moonlight, falling through a crevice in the shutters, threw a straight line of about an inch or so thick upon the floor, clear, sharp, and intensely brilliant against the darkness. I leave you to conceive my horror when, upon looking at this said line of light, I saw there a naked human toe, nothing more. For the first instant, I thought the vision must be some effect of moonlight, then that I was only half awake and could not see distinctly. So I rubbed my eyes 2 or 3 times and looked again. Still there was the accursed thing, plain, distinct, immovable, marble-like in its fixedness and rigidity, but in everything else horribly human. I am not an easily frightened man. No one who has traveled so much and seen so much and been exposed to so many dangers as I can be. But there was something so mysterious and unusual in the appearance of this single toe that for a short time I could not think what to be at. So I did nothing but stare at it in a state of utter bewilderment. At length, however, as the toe did not vanish under my steady gaze, I thought I might as well change my tactics, and remembering that all midnight invaders, be they thieves, ghosts, or devils, dislike nothing so much as a good noise, I shouted out in a loud voice, "Who's there?" The toe immediately disappeared in the darkness. Almost simultaneously with my words, I leaped out of bed and rushed toward the place where I had beheld the strange appearance. The next instant I ran against something and felt an iron grip round my body. After this I have no distinct recollection of what occurred, excepting that a fearful struggle ensued between me and my unseen opponent, that every now and then we were violently hurled to the floor, from which we always rose again in an instant, locked in a deadly embrace, that we tugged and strained and pulled and pushed, I in the convulsive and frantic energy of a fight for life, he, for by this time I had discovered that the intruder was a human being, actuated by some passion of which I was ignorant, that we whirled round and round, cheek to cheek and arm to arm, in fierce contest, until the room appeared to whiz round with us, and that at least a dozen people, my fellow traveler among them, roused, I suppose, by our repeated falls, came pouring into the room with lights and showed me struggling with a man having nothing on but a shirt, whose long tangled hair and wild, unsettled eyes told me he was insane. And then, for the first time, I became aware that I had received in the conflict several gashes from a knife, which my opponent still held in his hand. To conclude my story in a few words, for I dare say all of you by this time are getting very tired, it turned out that my midnight visitor was a madman who was being conveyed to a lunatic asylum at The Hague, and that he and his keeper had been obliged to stop at Delphi on their way. The poor fellow had contrived during the night to escape from his keeper, who had carelessly forgotten to lock the door of his chamber, and with that irresistible desire to shed blood peculiar to many insane people, had possessed himself of a pocket-knife belonging to the man who had charge of him, entered my room, which was most likely the only one in the house unfastened, and was probably meditating the fatal stroke when I saw his toe in the moonlight, the rest of his body being hidden in the shade. After this terrible freak of his, he was watched with much greater strictness, but I ought to observe, as some excuse for the keeper's negligence, that this was the first act of violence he had ever attempted.
The Long Arm of God by Ward Sterling. In a rock-bound gulch, half buried under the sands of summer, covered beneath 10 feet of snow in winter, 6 skeletons lie, grinning mockingly. In the hollow skulls of 2 are smooth, round holes. In one, a tiny leaden pellet leaps and bumps with each heave and groan of the sun-kissed ice in spring. The whitened ribs of 2 are seamed and scarred as by a knife. Upon the 6th there is no mark, nor comes there any rattling answer when some loathsome reptile, scurrying from its lair against the rocks and crevices, jars against the whitened shell that had once encased as foul a brain as e'er polluted God's green footstool. It lies far apart from the others, denied, even in death, the solace of their companionship. It is of the tenant of that 6th grim remnant, gazing, hollow-eyed, toward the heavens it can never enter, that this story is written. The flesh that once covered his weather-bleached bones has long since been carried away by carrion birds. His malignant soul is now frying in hell, unless by chance the devil, fearing the corruption of his powers of darkness, has denied the spirit admittance. He mocked God and spit upon his commandments, and the long arm of God reached out and found him, even in the chill, cold, Arctic hell, where he had hidden himself away. 1. Lee was the first to die. They found him a month after they had discovered that they were rich. Cold and stiff, his face twisted into an indescribable grimace, as if he had died in awful agony. Yet there had been no outcry, nor was there any mark upon his body to show how he had been struck down. The 6 of them, Lee the profane, Halligan the religious, Mason the student, Wentworth, ill-tempered and moody, Kelly the hot-blooded Celt, and the good-natured, plodding old Drew, were from the same Midwestern town. They had grown up together, attended the same school, soldiered in the same squad. The same girl had driven them to the land of long winters to seek their fortune. And, smarting under the same misfortune, they had been drawn together, forgetting, for the time, their differences, sharing one another's dangers, living out a common pulse, laughing at hardships, yet each praying that he might be the one upon whom fortune's smile would fall. Buoyed up by the memory of a beautiful girl far, far from their adopted home. After a fashion, they were happy. They were filled with primitive vigor and pulsing with life. They lived constant romances and did not know it, for such is the way of the far countries, and the lure of the north had gripped their heartstrings. They had been prospecting without results all summer when they chanced upon the unmarked blind canyon, which was destined to be their burial place. Following the noisy little creek up the gulch to the spot where it bubbled from the side of the rocky wall which blocked the further end of the canyon between two gray, grim mountains, they decided to hole in for the winter. There were signs of gold everywhere. A cabin, old and weather-beaten, one of the unsolved mysteries of the ever-mysterious North, stood ready for their occupancy with a small amount of repairing. Nearby were a dozen mounds, grim reminders of the tragic past. In the cabin were bags filled with nuggets, their coverings rotted away. The whole place breathed of mystery and treasure untold. Wood was plentiful, and game was abundant. Halligan and Lee were sent back for supplies. The others divided their time between prospecting the gulch and putting in shape their shack, a 4-roomed affair, for they intended spending the winter in comfort. 2 weeks after the return of the two, the partners awoke to the realization that they were rich. Before they could even estimate the extent of their find, winter arrived, with its long, cold nights, burying the old cabin almost to the eaves under a mass of snow which filled the gulch, tying them up efficiently for the remainder of the season. There is no stronger test of a friendship than the placing of strong, vigorous men for several long, weary months in enforced confinement, with little to do save eat and sleep, forced to gaze at each other day after day. They are apt to fall into physical lethargy, which eventually creates a nervous tension like nothing else in the world. Petty quarrels become serious matters. Molehills are magnified into mountains. They grow to hate the sight of each other and become suspicious of what, under other circumstances, would not be noticed. And when each looks upon his companions as his rivals for the hand of a beautiful woman, hell is bound to break loose sooner or later. It is an inevitable fate. 2. Warm, they found the grisly horror that was Lee, lying stark and stiff in his bunk, gazing, glassy-eyed, toward the ceiling. There was no thought of foul play. It was Halligan who, in straightening out the cold, clenched fingers, discovered the tiny thread of gray wool in the doubled-up fist, and called the attention of the others to it. Wentworth was the owner of the only gray shirt in camp. The others wore khaki or blue. It had been a cold night, and he had slept in it. Instantly, all eyes turned upon him, although no word was spoken. He turned upon his silent accusers, his lips drawn back in a wolfish snarl. "Damn it, if you think I done it, say so," he growled. "If I killed him, how did I do it? And when? You, Halligan, slept in the same room with us." Halligan shook his head sadly. "When I went to bed, the two of you and Kelly were soldering that hole in the old coffee pot. I went to sleep before either of you turned in." Kelly looked at Halligan angrily, then cast a sympathetic glance at Wentworth. "I'm sorry to say, boys, that I hit the hay before the other two. I wish now that I hadn't, because I'm confident that, if Lee was killed, and I don't think that he was, it wasn't Wentworth that done it. He's not that stripe. In fact," he hastened on, "none of the bunch is." Wentworth snorted. Keep your blasted sympathy to yourself. I don't want it, he growled. Halligan shook his head mournfully. It's a visitation from God upon Lee for his blasphemy, he muttered. I warned him against it many a time. Poor boy. They sat around all day discussing their companion's sudden taking away, all but Wentworth. He sat alone in a corner, silently nursing his grievances. They had searched the body. There was not a mark upon it. The other four were loud in their statements that Lee must have died a natural death. But there was a feeling of coldness, an indescribable something that cast a pall over them all. A feeling toward their once trusted comrade. A feeling that the long, lonely days of idleness and soundless nights of the past now magnified into an unspoken suspicion. Late in the afternoon, they carried Lee's body up the gulch a few yards and buried it in a shallow grave in the ice and snow, where it would have to lie until spring opened up again. The ground was frozen too hard to dig a grave, being covered by a dozen feet of hard-packed snow and ice. Only Wentworth remained away from the simple funeral, sitting glumly by himself inside the cabin, while Halligan mumbled, brokenly, as much as he could remember of the burial service. It was late when they retired that night, all but Wentworth. He refused to eat any supper, throwing himself into his bunk immediately after the others had finished eating, where he lay, scowling, his eyes staring into vacancy. 3. They slept fitfully. It was nearly morning when they were awakened by the sharp explosion of a gun. They leapt to their feet, and one of them struck a match and lighted a flickering tallow candle. Wentworth lay dead in his blankets. Over him hung a pall of acrid smoke. He lay upon his back, a bullet hole in his temple, his lips drawn back in the same wolfish snarl he had worn during the day. On the floor beside him, where it had been dropped from his nerveless hand, lay his revolver. Next morning they buried him in the snow beside the man who they were now sure had been his victim. And once more it was Halligan who was called upon to say a prayer. Again he repeated his warning. "Can't you see, boys," he mourned, "that the Lord visited his wrath upon Wentworth for his sins, just as he did upon Lee? A man's evil deeds will find him out. It's a warning for you all to repent before it's too late." There was no work done that day. Even the dishes were allowed to go greasy and unwashed while they discussed again and again the various phases of the second tragedy that had befallen their little community. Wentworth had never been popular with the others, his moroseness and general tone of surly indifference to everything keeping him from being the general favorite that the profane but good-natured Lee had been. Yet it was hard to believe that he had stooped to murder. As usual, it was Halligan, the born leader, who aroused them from their apathy. Putting the others to cleaning up the dishes, he cooked a hasty supper and compelled the three to eat with him. "There's no use getting the doldrums," he admonished them. "They're dead, and sitting around mooning won't bring 'em back. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Of course, it's up to us to see that their heirs get their share of the mine after we've taken our wages out for working it. When we've fed and cleaned up the shack, we'll have a game of cards and turn in early. I, for one, am sleepy." So were they all, for within an hour after they had eaten, the four of them were yawning vigorously. They crawled into their bunks. Halligan, who refused to sleep in the room where Lee and Wentworth had met their deaths, climbed into the spare bunk with the others. Mason was the first to awaken next morning. He shouted for the others as he leapt out of his blankets and crawled into his clothes. Replenishing the logs in the fireplace in the living room, he again yelled at the other three and turned his attention to breakfast. A second later, a loud cry from Kelly brought Halligan to his feet, while Mason ran in from the outer room. For Drew lay dead in his bunk. Between his ribs, buried to the hilt, was a hunting knife. And it was Mason's knife. 4. Kelly drew the knife from the wound and looked at the initials carved on the handle. "So it was you after all, was it, you skunk?" he snarled at Mason. "You with your damned sneaky ways and your smooth, oily manner, eh? Though why you were fool enough to leave your knife sticking in him is what I can't understand. Scared away, were you?" Mason stepped back a pace, a look of amazement on his proud face. "I swear by the ever-living God, boys, that I am innocent," he declared. "Why would I kill Drew?" "Why? Yes, why?" snorted Kelly, his eyes glittering. "For the same reason that you killed Lee and threw the blame onto poor Wentworth, damn your soul. I suppose that Halligan and I were to be next, eh?" he went on. "With us out of the way, you'd be a rich man, and then you could go back and marry Cora Hunter. Oh, I'm no fool." Halligan, sitting on the edge of his bunk putting on his moccasins, said nothing. Kelly, his Celtic temper leaping to the surface, was intensely angry. Mason, too, was a man of hot passions, although he held them under better restraint than did the Irishman. He took a half step toward his accusers. "Kelly and Halligan," he began in a level voice, "I didn't kill Drew, nor had I a hand in the death of Lee. It's just as much a mystery to me how my knife got there as it is to you." "'Tis no mystery to me," snapped Kelly. "You put it there, you cur." "You're a damn liar." Kelly leapt upon him, the knife he still had in his hand upraised. Mason's fist met him halfway, striking him squarely in the face, but failing to stop his rush. With a lurid oath, the burly Irishman jabbed the weapon into the other's side half a dozen times. With his bare fists, Mason fought the other as best he could for a second or two. His fingers clutched weakly about his antagonist's windpipe. He struggled blindly for a second, fumbling feebly for a hold. Then his knees doubled under him, and, with a dull moan, he sank to the floor at Kelly's feet. Without a sign of undue haste, Halligan buckled his belt and holster about his waist. Coolly, he unbuckled the holster and drew the gun. He cocked the weapon, and, with his finger on the trigger, waited for the others to settle their argument. "Did you get him?" he asked, as Kelly stepped back and wiped the blood from his streaming nose. "Yes, and I'm damn glad of it, the swine." Before he could turn around, Halligan placed the muzzle of his gun against the back of the Irishman's head and pulled the trigger. A dazed expression crept over Kelly's face. The knife dropped from his hand. Then he fell in a heap across the body of his late antagonist. Halligan replaced the weapon in its holster and felt of the Irishman's heart. Assuring himself that it had ceased to beat, he raised his eyes to Mason, who was staring at him dazedly. "You saved my life, Halligan," the wounded man muttered thickly. "But you took so long doing it, he got me anyway. Much obliged just the same." Halligan grinned. "If I did, I'm sorry," he remarked cheerfully, "'cause then I'll have to finish you myself. It wouldn't do for you to live, you see, because you know too much. And besides, I want everything for myself, the girl and the money both." The dying man looked at him curiously. "You don't mean that it was you, Halligan? Good God, and I never suspected." Halligan sat down on the edge of his bunk and laughed good-humoredly as he unbuckled his gun and threw it across the foot of the bed. "I don't mind telling you about it," he said quickly, because you'll soon be where you can never tell." He rolled a cigarette and, lighting it, inhaled a whiff before he continued. "You see, Mason, I figured out long ago that as soon as we struck it rich, and I felt sure we would sooner or later, it would be survival of the fittest. I knew that there was no chance for any of us with Cora until we had money. She's a selfish little devil, but she's worth fighting for. And with all of us rich, we would be just where we started. But now it'll be me alone, just me. When we struck pay here, you remember that it was my suggestion putting in here for the winter. I knew that it would be easy for me to plant the seed of suspicion in all of you, for, deep down in your hearts, you all felt as I did, and each one of you suspected the others. And you were as jealous as a bunch of chorus girls. Wentworth killed Lee, all right. I watched him do it from the other room, where I was supposed to be asleep. I suggested the idea to him without him knowing it several days before. He and I were doing a job of soldering, and I told him the story I got from my grandmother about a man who had murdered his wife by pouring a drop of hot lead in her ear. After Kelly turned in that night, Lee and Wentworth sat up soldering. You remember? Finally, Lee dropped off to sleep with his head on the table. It was too good an opportunity for Wentworth to miss, for he hated Lee's guts. So he drops a bit of hot solder into Lee's ear. He died without a struggle, as I knew he would, for the infernal stuff paralyzes every faculty. Afterward, Wentworth took off his boots and sneaked up to see if we were asleep. Finding that we were, he carried Lee in and laid him on his bunk. You remember how Wentworth tore his shirt on that nail there by the door? I recollected that there was a scrap of wool hanging onto it. When Wentworth went back into the other room to put away his tools, I jumped out, took the little piece of wool from the nail, and got it into Lee's clenched fingers, and jumped back into bed before Wentworth returned. Pretty smooth, eh? Wentworth couldn't stand the gaff. He imagined that I knew that he had killed Lee, so he killed himself." Mason groaned. "I killed Wentworth," he blurted out. "You told me that he had, about what he had done to Cora. I saw that it was a good opportunity to get rid of him and let you fellows think he had done it himself. You put me up to it, you devil." Halligan laughed. "So it was you after all, eh?" he chuckled. "I knew that you had swallowed my little story, but I confess that I didn't think you would get busy so quick." "But the letter you showed me, from her, from Cora." Halligan chuckled again. "Mason, I don't mind telling you that when I went for supplies with Lee, I fixed up 5 letters, all identical except the names. I put one of your names in each letter. I showed each one of you a different letter, playing each one of you against the others. That's why Kelly knifed you. He didn't care a cuss for Drew. He was itching for an opportunity to get you, see? I stuck Drew myself, using your knife to throw suspicion on you, knowing that it would start the Irishman. Where I miscalculated was in thinking that you'd be armed. I didn't want to stain my own hands with murder any more than I had to. I put some dope in all of your grub last night when I got supper, so that I could pull off the stunt without arousing you. That idea of mine of playing each one of you against the others was pretty slick, wasn't it? No one knows of the existence of this blind gulch here. I'll have a pretty good nest egg, and after I marry Cora, I can always take a run back here for more if I need it. Of course, I'll bury all of you fellows nice and shipshape, and I'll tell them back home about our separating, and each going in a different direction. Oh, I've got a good yarn cooked up all right." The wounded man glared at him malignantly. "Damn you!" he cried. "God's long arm will get you yet, even out here in the ice and snow of this God-forsaken country." Halligan smiled. "God? Bah! If I believed in such foolishness, I'd have never won out over the rest of you. But I made you think I did, and that's how I got the best of you. 5. He arose and stretched himself. Then, seizing the dead man, he dragged his victim out of doors and buried him alongside of the others. Mason watched him at his work with glaring eyes. Then, as he left the room, the wounded man dragged himself across the few feet that separated him from the bunk. Carefully, every movement filled with pain, he reached up and took the gun. He tried to lift himself to his feet and felt himself going. "Oh, God," he murmured. "Help me! Help me! Get him! Don't let him get away with it! Help me, for Cora's sake!" He succeeded in getting the weapon cocked and hiding it inside his trouser pocket. His jaw dropped, and with a convulsive twitch, he died. Halligan finished burying Kelly and returned to the cabin for warmth. Replenishing the fire, he entered the other room and found Mason dead. Throwing him across his shoulder, he staggered out into the gulch again and laid him on the snow crust while he hastily scooped another shallow grave. He bent over the body to roll it into the hole. As he did so, there was a flash and a report. The bullet swept across his lids, searing them with its heat. His eyes were filled with powder. Blinded, sobbing with his misery, he tried to grope his way back to the cabin. He lost his sense of direction. He stumbled and fell, arose and stumbled again. His snowshoes dropped from his feet. Too miserable to care, he tried to go on without them. He broke through the crust to his waist. On and on he floundered his way, whimpering with pain, chilled to the marrow, thinking to reach the cabin, but ever getting further from it. And finally, exhausted, blinded, freezing, he fell into the stupor which marks the beginning of the end in the land of eternal snow. For the sudden cold grasping hold of the dead body of Mason had hastened rigor mortis. The dead fingers, stiffening suddenly, had tightened about the trigger of the hidden revolver. It was the long arm of God.
Thanks for listening. Information for each story, as well as the readers, is in the description. Please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.